The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien. In the field. At daybreak, the platoon of 18 soldiers formed into a loose rank and began wadding side by side through the deep muck of the shipfield. They moved slowly in the rain, leaning forward, heads down. They used the butts of their weapons as probes, wadding across the field to the river and then turning back and wadding back again. They were tired and miserable. All they wanted now was to get it finished. Kiowa was gone. He was under the mud and water, folded in with the war, and their only thought was to find him and dig him out, and then move on to some place dry and warm. It had been a hard night, maybe the worst ever. The rains had fallen without stop, and the Song Trebong had overflowed its banks, and the muck had now risen thigh deep in the field along the river. A low, gray mist hovered over the land. Off to the west there was thunder, soft little moaning sounds, and monsoon seemed to be a lasting element of the war. The 18 soldiers moved in silence. First Lieutenant Jimmy Cross went first, now and then straightening out the rank, closing up the gaps. His uniform was dark with mud. His arms and face were filthy. Early in the morning he had radioed in the MIA report, giving the name and circumstances. But he was now determined to find this man no matter what, even if it meant flying in slabs of concrete and damming up the river and draining the entire field. He would not lose a member of his command like this. It wasn't right. Kiowa had been a fine soldier and a fine human being, a devout Baptist, and there was no way Lieutenant Cross would allow such a good man to be lost under the slime of the shipfield. Briefly, he stopped and watched the clouds. Except for some occasional thunder, it seemed a deeply quiet morning. Just the rain and the steady sloshing sounds of 18 men wading through the thick waters. Lieutenant Cross wished the rain would let up. Even for an hour, it would only make things easier. But then he shrugged. The rain was the war, and you had to fight it. Turning, he looked out across the field and yelled at one of his men to close up the rank. Not a man, really, a boy. The young soldier stood off by himself at the center of the field in knee-deep water, reaching down with both hands as if chasing some object beneath the surface. The boy's shoulders were shaking. Jimmy Cross yelled again, but the young soldier did not turn or look up. In his hooded poncho, everything caked with mud. The boy's face was impossible to make out. The filth seemed to erase identities, transforming the men into identical copies of single soldiers, which was exactly how Jimmy Cross had been trained to treat them, as interchangeable units of command. It was difficult sometimes, as he tried to avoid that sort of thinking. He had no military ambitions. He preferred to view his men as units, not as units, but as human beings. And Kiowa had been a splendid human being, the very best, intelligent and gentle and quiet-spoken. Very brave, too, and decent. The kid's father taught Sunday school in Oklahoma City, where Kiowa had been raised to believe in the promise of salvation under Jesus Christ. And the conviction had been present in the boy's smile, in his posture toward the world, in the way he never went anywhere without an illustrated New Testament that his father had mailed to him as a birthday present back in January. A crime, Jimmy Cross thought. Looking out toward the river, he knew for a fact that he made a mistake setting up here. The order had come from higher, true, but still, he would have exercised some field discretion. He should have moved to higher ground for the night. Should have radioed in false coordinates. There was nothing he could do now, but still, it was a mistake, and a hideous waste. He felt sick about it, standing in the deep waters of the field. First Lieutenant Jimmy Cross began composing a letter in his head to the kid's father, not mentioning the shitfield, just saying what a fine soldier Kiowa had been, and what a fine human being, and how he was the kind of son that any father could be proud of forever. The search went slowly. For a time the morning seemed to brighten, the sky going to a lighter shade of silver. But then the rains came back hard and steady. There was a feel of permanent twilight, and the far left of the line, Azar and Norman Boker and Mitchell Sanders wadded along the edge of the field closest to the river. They were all tall men, but at times the muck came to the mid-thighs and other times to the crotch. Azar kept shaking his head. He coughed and shook his head and said, "Man, talk about irony. I bet if Kiowa was here, I bet he'd just laugh. Eating shit, it's your classic irony." "Fine," Norman Boker said. "Now pipe down." Azar sighed. "Wasted in the waste," he said. "A shit field. You gotta admit, it's pure world-class irony." The three men moved with slow, heavy steps. It was hard to keep balance. Their boots sank into the ooze, which produced a powerful downward suction, and with each step they would have to pull hard to break the hold. The rain made quick dents in the water, like tiny mouths, and the stink was everywhere. When they reached the river, they shifted a few meters to the north and began wading back up the field. Occasionally, they used their weapons to test the bottom, but mostly they'd search for feet. "A classic case," Azar was saying. "Biting the dirt, so to speak. That tells the story." "Enough," Boker said. "Like those old cowboy movies. One more redskin bites the dirt." "I'm serious, man. Zip it shut." Azar smiled and said, "Classic." The morning was cold and wet. They had not slept during the night, not even for a few moments, and all three of them were feeling the tension as they moved across the field toward the river. There was nothing they could do for Kiowa. Just find him and slide him aboard a chopper. Whenever a man died, it was always the same. A desire to get it over quickly. No fuss or ceremony, and what they wanted now was to head for a vial and get under a roof and forget what had happened during the night. Halfway across the field, Mitchell Sanders stopped. He stood for a moment with his eyes shut, feeling along the bottom with a foot. Then he passed his weapon over to Norman Boker and reached down into the muck. After a second, he hauled up a filthy green rucksack. The three men did not speak for a time. The pack was heavy with mud and water, dead-looking. Inside were a pair of moccasins and an illustrated New Testament. "Well," Mr. Sanders finally said, "the guy's around here somewhere. Better tell the LT. Screw him." "Yeah, but," some Lieutenant Sanders said, "camps us in the toilet. Man, don't know shit." "Nobody knew," Boker said. "Maybe so, maybe not. 10 billion places we could have set up last night, and the man picks a latrine." Norman Boker stared down at the rucksack. It was made of dark green nylon with an aluminum frame, but now it had the curious look of flesh. "It wasn't the LT's fault," Boker said quietly. "Whose then?" "Nobody's. Nobody knew till afterward." Mitchell Sanders made a sound in his throat. He hoisted up the rucksack, slipped into the harness, and pulled the straps tight. "All right, but this much for sure. The man knew it was raining. He knew about the river. 1 + 1. Add it up. You get exactly what happened." Sanders glared over at the river. "Move it," he said. "Kiowa's waiting on us." Slowly then, bending against the rain, Azar and Norman Boker and Mitchell Sanders began wading again through the deep waters, their eyes down, circling out from where they had found the rucksack.